Every generation believes it is the one finally waking up. That now, at last, people have opened their eyes to the corruption, the hypocrisy, the incompetence of those in power. The young point at the old and say, "You built this mess." The people point at their leaders and say, "You Stev betrayed us." And the leaders, in quiet rooms, sigh to each other. They don't hest understand what it takes to keep the world from falling apart. This cycle of admiration turning into rebellion, of trust decaying into rage, repeats across centuries. It is the rhythm of history itself. Empires rise not only through the strength of their rulers, but through the faith of their people. And when that faith dies, everything begins to rot from within. Plato saw this pattern over 2,000 years ago. He warned that every form of government carries within it the seed of its own destruction. Democracy, he said, eventually devours itself, because freedom, when unanchored by wisdom, turns into chaos. The people, tired of being deceived, turn against their rulers, but then, in their hunger for justice, they elevate new leaders, often those who promise simple answers to complex problems. And thus the cycle continues. Idealism gives birth to tyranny, and tyranny gives birth to new revolutions. Today we see this again. Across nations, generations are turning on their institutions, their teachers, their politicians, their elders, their heroes. There is a sense of betrayal, a loss of faith, a collapse of meaning. But the question we must ask is deeper than politics. Why does this keep happening? Why do we, generation after generation, destroy the very leaders we once begged to save us? In this exploration, we'll unravel 6 insights drawn from Plato, Nietzsche, Jung, and others that reveal the timeless psychological and philosophical forces driving this pattern. By the end, you may see that the crisis of leadership isn't just out there in the world, it's something unfolding inside each of us. It always begins with hope. A nation, a company, even a family, all leadership starts with a kind of sacred trust. People believe that someone knows the way. They hand over their faith, not because they are weak, but because they must. No society can function without hierarchy, without a structure that says, "You lead and I will follow." But time erodes everything. The leader grows comfortable. The people grow restless. The ideals that once inspired begin to harden into rituals, and rituals, when no longer understood, become cages. And so begins the slow, invisible turning of the wheel, the cycle of distrust. Plato described this process in the Republic with astonishing precision. He argued that every system of government carries within it the seed of its opposite. Aristocracy, rule by the wise, decays into timocracy, rule by the ambitious. Timocracy rots into oligarchy, rule by the rich. Oligarchy breeds democracy, rule by the masses. And democracy, when unmoored from truth, inevitably births tyranny. It is one of history's cruelest ironies that freedom unchecked leads back to slavery. Plato's insight wasn't merely political, it was psychological. He believed that societies reflect the souls of their citizens. When the inner life of a people becomes chaotic, their politics mirror that chaos. When reason, discipline, and virtue give way to appetite and resentment, the city, like the individual, loses its harmony. We can see this pattern everywhere today. The faith once placed in leaders, teachers, scientists, journalists, and even parents has dissolved into suspicion. The modern citizen has become a skeptic by default, not because they have learned more, but because they have been disappointed too many times. Each betrayal, each hypocrisy revealed eats away at the fragile fabric of trust until cynicism feels safer than belief. But cynicism, Plato might say, is not wisdom. It is the despair of wisdom denied. The ancient Greeks believed that every community was bound together by a shared myth, not a falsehood, but a guiding story that gave meaning to obedience and sacrifice. When that story breaks, the people no longer see their leaders as guardians of a sacred order, but as actors in a corrupt play. And once the mask falls, even the good among them cannot command faith. This is the moment we are living in now, a time when no one is trusted, and everyone claims to see through everything. But as C.S. Lewis warned, to see through everything is the same as not to see. We have become so skilled at unmasking power that we've forgotten how to recognize virtue. So the cycle continues. The people withdraw their faith. The leaders, feeling untrusted, become defensive, secretive, controlling. Each side mirrors the other's fear until both are trapped in a dance of mutual resentment. It is not simply that the people lose faith in their rulers, the rulers too lose faith in their people. And beneath it all, something tragic unfolds. We forget that leadership is not the problem. The loss of wisdom is. Plato believed that leadership could only endure when guided by philosophy, when those who rule are lovers of truth, not lovers of power. For once truth is replaced by popularity, the state becomes an echo chamber of emotion. And in that echo, every generation begins again, denouncing their leaders, building new ones, only to repeat the same pattern. So perhaps the question is not why we turn against our leaders, but why we keep expecting them to save us. Freedom is the most beautiful and the most dangerous gift a society can give itself. At first, it feels like awakening. Rules loosen, hierarchies dissolve, the air feels lighter. Every person begins to believe that they are the author of their own life, that they owe obedience to no one. It is intoxicating, this new sense of limitless possibility. But what happens when the chains are cut and we realize we no longer know where to walk? Plato warned that a democracy, in its final stage, becomes obsessed with freedom to the point of madness. The citizens, he wrote, become so sensitive that they chafe at the smallest touch of authority. In their hunger to be free of all restraint, they begin to reject every form of guidance, even that which once kept them safe. And in that moment, the soul of freedom begins to darken. Nietzsche, centuries later, would see the same sickness taking hold of modern man. He called it nihilism, the collapse of all higher values, the moment when humanity becomes lost in its own freedom. God is dead, he said, not as a celebration, but as a diagnosis. We killed the old order, but we have not yet built a new one strong enough to bear the weight of meaning. The result? Anxiety disguised as liberation. Look around today, and Plato's prophecy feels eerily familiar. We speak endlessly about freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of choice, freedom of identity. Yet beneath the surface, we are exhausted. Freedom without wisdom has made us restless. The endless array of options has not set us free. It has made us uncertain, fragmented. To be free, truly free, requires something deeper than escape from control. It requires the capacity to govern oneself. That is the lesson Plato tried to teach the Athenians, that external liberty is worthless without internal order. When the inner world is chaotic, freedom becomes a kind of prison, a chaos of competing desires, pulling us in every direction. Nietzsche, too, understood this. His ideal was not the free man in the political sense, but the sovereign individual, one who has learned to master his own impulses, to give himself law. He who cannot obey himself, Nietzsche wrote, will be commanded. And that is precisely what happens to societies that mistake freedom for wisdom. When everyone becomes their own ruler, no one truly rules, and into that vacuum steps the tyrant, the demagogue, the one who promises to restore order, to make sense of the chaos. It is a tragic pattern. We destroy authority in the name of freedom, only to beg for authority again in the name of safety. The shadow of freedom is fear, fear of responsibility, fear of directionlessness, fear of the weight of our own choices. And when that fear grows unbearable, the people reach for a new father figure, a savior who will relieve them of the burden of thinking for themselves. In this way, Plato's cycle continues. The democracy that once celebrated freedom collapses into tyranny, not because the tyrant was strong, but because the people were weak. Modern psychology echoes this insight. Erich Fromm, in Escape from Freedom, wrote that when freedom becomes too much to bear, people unconsciously surrender it. They trade liberty for certainty, autonomy for belonging. The frightened individual, he wrote, seeks to escape from freedom by turning to authoritarianism. And so the wheel turns again. We see it in our politics, in our workplaces, our families, even in our own minds. We crave freedom, yet recoil from its emptiness. We demand leadership, yet resent its authority. We long for meaning, yet fear the discipline it requires. Perhaps this is the secret Plato and Nietzsche both knew. Freedom is not the absence of restraint. It is the art of self-mastery. The danger of liberation is not chaos in the streets. It is chaos within the soul. And the societies that survive are not the most liberated, but the most centered. Every generation carries a quiet, unspoken desire to be free from the shadow of those who came before. We see it in families, in cultures, in nations. The young feel suffocated by the old. The students grow restless with their teachers. The citizens revolt against their rulers. It is not mere politics, it is psychology. Carl Jung saw this rebellion as a necessary stage of human evolution. He called it the death of the father, not the literal parent, but the symbolic archetype of authority, tradition, and inherited truth. To mature, Jung said, the psyche must challenge and eventually transcend its internal father. It must question the beliefs it inherited and discover its own voice. This confrontation is painful, but essential. Without it, there is no individuality. Yet this rebellion, like all human drives, has a shadow. When the father, the symbolic representation of order, is overthrown too violently, the psyche loses its center. Without something higher to orient toward, freedom becomes disorientation, and rebellion becomes nihilism. Jung observed this dynamic unfolding not only in individuals, but in entire civilizations. When a culture loses faith in its gods, its traditions, and its moral frameworks, it experiences a kind of collective adolescence. Loud, defiant, and uncertain, it wants to create something new, but it does not yet know how. We can see this playing out today. The modern world is filled with voices declaring the old ways have failed, and perhaps they have. Religion has lost its moral authority. Institutions seem corrupt. The family structure, once sacred, has fractured. The old stories no longer inspire us. But in the absence of the father, something terrifying happens. The child becomes the ruler of the house. Jung warned that when the archetype of the father is destroyed, the shadow fills the void. The repressed, unconscious forces, anger, envy, chaos, rush to take the throne, and without the guidance of something transcendent, societies regress rather than evolve. This is why revolutions, though often justified, so easily descend into violence. The oppressed overthrow their oppressors, but in doing so, they inherit the same power they once despised. The child becomes the parent it hated because it has not yet understood the deeper principle that made authority necessary in the first place. In Jungian terms, the father is not simply a man. He is the principle of structure, the voice that says, you must, when every instinct says, I won't. To kill that voice without replacing it with inner discipline is to remove the spine from the psyche. This is the tragedy of the modern age. We have dethroned every external authority, but we have not yet built an internal one. Nietzsche foresaw this when he wrote, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. The result, he said, is a culture that no longer knows what is good, only what is desired. Jung took this further. If we do not reconcile with the Father, that is, with the necessity of order and responsibility, we remain trapped in perpetual adolescence. We spend our lives rebelling against what we secretly crave, structure, purpose, and meaning. So how does one resolve this paradox? Not by returning to blind obedience, but by internalizing the Father, by transforming the external authority into inner wisdom. This, Jung said, is the true task of maturity, to integrate the Father, not destroy him. Only then can rebellion give birth to creation. Only then can freedom become strength rather than chaos. Because the real danger is not killing the Father. It is never becoming one yourself. When trust collapses and institutions crumble, a peculiar hunger awakens in the collective soul. The people no longer believe in their leaders, yet they cannot live without someone to believe in. It is in such times that the outsider emerges. He is the one who stands apart from the establishment, who speaks not with the polished restraint of politicians, but with the raw fire of resentment. He tells the people what they already feel, but have been afraid to say. He becomes the embodiment of their anger, their exhaustion, their longing for simplicity in a world grown too complex. Plato described this figure in the Republic long before he ever walked the earth. He wrote that when democracy reaches its breaking point, when freedom turns into chaos and everyone claims equality with everyone else, the crowd begins to crave a strong man, someone who promises to speak for the people. This person, Plato warned, begins as the protector of the people, but soon becomes their tyrant. It is a haunting prophecy, repeated in every century. Machiavelli later understood this dynamic with frightening clarity. In The Prince, he observed that power often belongs not to those who deserve it, but to those who understand human fear. The wise ruler, he said, must learn not to be good, but to be effective, to control perception, to manipulate hope, to play the role the people demand. But Jung would see something deeper happening beneath the politics, a drama unfolding in the collective unconscious. The populist leader, he said, is not merely a manipulator. He is a symbol, an archetype made flesh. He mirrors the repressed desires and fears of the collective psyche. The more a society denies its own shadow, its greed, anger, and need for control, the more it projects those traits onto a single figure. That figure can appear as hero or villain, savior or devil, depending on what the collective most needs to see. Consider how nations rally around charismatic outsiders during moments of chaos. They appear from nowhere, promising to restore dignity, truth, greatness. Their power does not come from their policies, but from their symbolism. They are living metaphors, vessels for the people's unconscious longing for order, vengeance, and redemption. It is easy to condemn such figures, but Jung would caution us not to do so too quickly. To hate them blindly is to miss the truth they reveal, that they are us. They rise from our neglect, from our unresolved contradictions, from the vacuum left when genuine wisdom disappears. Every populist movement, in this sense, is a psychological event, a collective eruption of what has been denied too long. When a society refuses to confront its own corruption, its own laziness, its own complicity, it will conjure a scapegoat or a savior to bear that burden for it. The tragedy, of course, is that the savior usually becomes the new oppressor. The people project their unmet moral ideals onto him, and when he inevitably fails, the cycle of betrayal renews itself. Hope becomes disillusionment, faith becomes fury, and the people once again turn against the very leader they created. We often imagine the outsider as the antidote to corruption. But what if he is the symptom? What if the populace does not save the people, but reveals how lost they already are? Plato, Machiavelli, and Jung would agree on one point. No system of power can save a society that refuses to know itself. Until we confront our own shadow, we will continue to summon false prophets to act it out for us. So the question becomes, do we dare to look inward, not to blame, but to understand? Because every time the world cries, someone must fix this, the unconscious quietly whispers back, yes, and that someone is you. The end of a civilization rarely looks like fire and war. It looks like laughter, bitter, cynical, disbelieving laughter. That's what happens when people stop taking their own institutions seriously. When justice becomes theater, when education becomes marketing, when religion becomes spectacle, and when truth itself becomes a matter of preference. Plato warned that this would be democracy's fatal flaw, the confusion of freedom with opinion. In the Republic, he writes that when every voice claims equal authority, wisdom is drowned out by noise. People begin to treat all ideas as interchangeable, as though truth itself were just another lifestyle choice. And when truth loses its weight, the world loses its center. It begins quietly. A teacher stops believing in the value of teaching, but keeps showing up for the paycheck. A journalist stops searching for truth and starts searching for clicks. A priest stops believing in God, but keeps preaching because it pays the rent. Each small act of spiritual dishonesty adds up until the entire culture becomes a performance, an empty ritual repeating words that no one believes anymore. The institutions remain, but their souls are gone. This, Plato said, is when democracy dies, not in revolution, but in ridicule. People no longer trust those in power because they sense the hollowness beneath their words, and yet the people themselves are part of the same illusion. They too perform, posture, pretend. They too are caught in the game of appearances. The philosopher's task in such an age is not to win arguments, but to awaken conscience. Nietzsche saw the same decay unfolding in modern Europe. He called it the transvaluation of values, the slow death of all shared meaning, the great moral frameworks, religious, political, philosophical, had collapsed, leaving humanity unmoored. The desert grows, he wrote. Woe to him who hides the desert within. In our time, that desert has become digital. We are surrounded by information, but starved of truth. Every institution speaks in slogans. Every ideology claims moral purity. But beneath the noise, there is exhaustion, a quiet despair that we try to silence with outrage. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps, understood this better than most. He observed that the deepest crisis of modern life is not political, but existential, a vacuum of meaning. When people no longer know why they live, they become vulnerable to any ideology that promises certainty. Those who have a why to live, he wrote, can bear almost anyhow. And those without a why, they begin to drift. The tragedy of a society that loses its soul is that it still functions for a while. The trains run, the economy hums, the elections continue, but everything feels hollow. People become consumers of everything, of goods, of information, even of spirituality. Life becomes transactional rather than transcendent. Plato believed that such a world cannot be saved by politics. It can only be renewed through the rebirth of the soul, through the rediscovery of wisdom, virtue, and truth as living realities, not abstractions. In other words, institutions collapse when individuals do. When the citizens no longer cultivate integrity within themselves, their institutions simply mirror that emptiness. The philosopher's duty, therefore, is not to destroy what exists, but to restore its meaning, to re-enchant the world by reminding it of what it has forgotten. Because the loss of meaning is not the end of civilization. It is an invitation, a dark night that demands we remember why we ever built civilizations in the first place. Perhaps this is what Plato meant when he wrote that the price of apathy towards public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. Apathy is not just political indifference, it is spiritual amnesia. And when a people forget who they are, they will believe anything and follow anyone. So maybe the first step in rebuilding trust isn't reforming the system, but rediscovering truth, not as an opinion, but as something sacred again. Every civilization that has ever fallen shared one forgotten truth. No reform can save a society that has lost its inner life. Plato understood this more clearly than anyone. He watched his beloved Athens, the cradle of art, reason, and democracy, descend into chaos, corruption, and demagoguery. He saw the trial and death of Socrates, the one man who dared to live by truth alone, and from that heartbreak, he conceived a radical idea that politics could never be healed by politics. Only philosophy could save the city, and not the kind that fills books, but the kind that transforms souls. Plato's philosopher king was not a dream of intellectual elites ruling over others. It was a symbol, a reminder that wisdom, not power, must sit at the center of human life. For when truth is dethroned, no amount of wealth, technology, or law can keep a civilization standing. The philosopher, in Plato's sense, is anyone who dares to see clearly, anyone who refuses the comfort of illusion, who loves truth more than popularity, and who seeks order not through control, but through understanding. And that philosopher can live in anyone, a teacher who chooses honesty over applause, a leader who listens before he commands, a parent who raises a child not to conform, but to think, a young person who questions not to rebel, but to grow. To be a philosopher, in the truest sense, is to live awake in a world that prefers sleep. Jung might call this the process of individuation, the awakening of the true self from the collective trance. It is the moment when we stop projecting our unmet hopes and fears onto leaders and begin to take responsibility for the kingdom within. Your vision will become clear, Jung wrote, only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. In this way, the rebirth of wisdom always begins quietly, in solitude, reflection, and courage. It is not about changing the world first, but about changing one's way of seeing. Nietzsche understood this too, though in darker tones, he saw the collapse of traditional values not as an end, but as a test. When the old gods die, he said it is up to the strong spirit, the Übermensch, to create new meaning, to give style to one's own character. Become who you are, he urged, which is another way of saying become your own philosopher king. This is where philosophy ceases to be theory and becomes practice. Sort of heavy of a collapse, a few individuals refuse to be swept away by despair. They rebuild inwardly what the world has forgotten. Outwardly, they live not by the slogans of their time, but by timeless principles, truth, justice, temperance, courage, and in doing so, they become the quiet architects of renewal. Every civilization depends on such people, those who think deeply, act with integrity, and love quietly in an age of noise. They are rarely famous. They do not shout, but their influence endures long after empires crumble. Plato's vision of the philosopher king was perhaps never meant to be fully realized. It was meant to remind us that leadership begins in self-leadership, that before we can rule anything, we must first rule ourselves. Because the truth is this: no savior is coming. No perfect system will rescue us. The return of wisdom, the return of meaning, begins when one person chooses to see with their own eyes again. And if enough of us do that, the world quietly changes. So if this vision resonates, if these ideas stir something in you, then perhaps you are already on that path. Subscribe if you wish to walk it with us. We explore these questions every week together. So how do leaders hide the truth in plain sight? Perhaps the real answer is they don't need to. Most of the time, we hide it from ourselves. We overlook the obvious, not because it's well concealed, but because it seems painful to see, because truth demands something of us: responsibility, humility, change. The magician's trick has always relied on one thing: our willingness to be deceived. We prefer a comfortable illusion to a difficult reality, and so those in power do not so much hide the truth as simply let us look away from it, while they build their thrones on our distraction. George Carlin saw this decades ago. He didn't just make jokes. He told prophecies wrapped in laughter. He warned that our attention would become the most valuable currency in the world, that politics would become theater, that education would stop teaching people how to think and instead teach them what to feel, and that when you teach generations to chase comfort instead of clarity, truth dies, not with a bang, but with applause. But Carlin also gave us the key awareness. Once you see the trick, the illusion loses its power. The moment you choose to think for yourself, to question, to reflect, to feel deeply again, you step out of the spell. That is the essence of philosophy. It is not about knowing more. It is about seeing better. To live philosophically is to move through the world with eyes open, to notice the small manipulations, the subtle hypocrisies, the quiet corruption, not with bitterness, but with clarity. It is to understand that every age has its own madness, and every generation must awaken from its own dream. When you begin to live like this, the world changes shape. You start to notice that real power is not found in palaces or parliaments, but in perception. The philosopher, the artist, the teacher, the quietly awake person, these are the ones who sustain the moral fabric of the world. And when enough people begin to see clearly, the game changes. Illusions dissolve not because they are destroyed, but because no one believes them anymore. This is why Plato said, the price of apathy toward public affairs is to be ruled by evil men, not because we are powerless, but because we have forgotten the power of thought, of conscience, of truth, spoken quietly but fearlessly. So perhaps the task before us is not to expose every lie, but to stop living by them, to begin with ourselves, to make truth visible again in our own words, our own work, our own relationships. That is how leaders truly lose their power. Not when they are overthrown, but when the people stop needing them to tell them who they are. The truth has always been in plain sight. It lives in the way you treat a stranger, in the courage to question what everyone else accepts, in the small private moments when you choose honesty over convenience. That is where all real revolutions begin, not in the streets, but in the soul. So tonight, as you step away from this video, I invite you to look around and within with new eyes, to see not just what others want you to see, but what has always been. Because once you can do that, no leader can hide the truth from you again. And that, George Carlin would say, is when the real show begins. Thank you for watching. Stay awake, stay curious, stay human.